coffee spilled like a slow sunrise across the formica as 6 shadows darkened the window, and the old man smiled. "You boys ordered Death to go, or are we dining in?" he asked, and the youngest one flinched when the others whispered his old name. Reaper. The diner sat where the desert forgot to be polite. A road came in, coughed up dust, and lost the courage to keep going. Inside, the air was a half-hearted blend of fried onions and swamp cooler breath. Jonas Cade sat alone at the corner booth that sagged in the middle, the same seat he chose every morning because it leaned toward the door, and the door told him the truth. He wore a sun-bleached jacket that had seen better wars and boots that made the floorboards remember their age. His hands were steady around the chipped mug, the way a sniper holds a breath. Mildred shuffled over with a pot that had outlived several marriages. She topped him off and gave him a look that could sand paint. "You planning to settle your tab in actual money today, or in another tall tale?" Jonas tipped his chin at the window where heat wavered like a mirage, trying to think of better ideas. "Depends," he said. "If company is coming, I might need store credit." Mildred snorted. "Honey, the only company you get is whatever the wind drags in, and it never leaves a tip." He watched the desert anyway. He watched the way it pretended to be empty, like a poker player who never scratches his ear when he has a good hand. A dust devil twirled itself apart. A hawk hung on invisible hooks in the sky. Far off, a glint that did not belong to sand flickered and vanished. Jonas did not turn his head. He studied the reflection in the metal napkin holder instead, the way one might read an old photograph for the thing everyone else missed. The reflection showed shapes moving low and fast, the kind of glide that comes from gravity-assist technology nobody on this road could afford. Mildred kept talking because that is what Mildred did when the room grew nervous. She told him the jukebox had swallowed 2 quarters and was now stuck on a love ballad that made her teeth itch. She told him the friar had a personality disorder and refused to make fries for men who wore sunglasses indoors. She told him that his scar was glowing again and that he should get that checked by someone with a degree. Jonas pulled his sleeve down. "It happens when there is a storm coming," he said. "Storms do not sneak," she said. "They announce themselves." Jonas nodded. "The good ones do." The door chimed and the room changed shape. 6 figures slid in on a ribbon of cold air that did not care about geography. Their armor looked poured rather than built, like metal had melted into choreography across their frames. The tallest wore a collar of beaten plates that caught the fluorescent lights and turned them mean. Their helmets stayed sealed, lenses shifting colors like lizard eyes finding a temperature they liked. Mildred put the coffee pot down with the decided calm of someone who once birthed twins during a power outage and was disappointed by both. "We are looking for a fugitive," the tallest said, and the language that came out of the helmet was translation clean but humorless. Jonas ticked his gaze to the deli case where the pies waited like patient planets. "Fugitive pie," he murmured, and Mildred whispered, "Do not." The leader swept the diner with a scanner that hummed like a tuning fork. The device paused on Jonas, blinked uncertain, and scrolled through text he had seen in other lifetimes. The youngest of them, smaller shoulders, nervous wrists, shifted his weight and looked at Jonas the way a rookie looks at a legend when he is not supposed to. The leader lifted the scanner higher, and the hum turned thin. "Identity mismatch," he said. "Records indicate civilian status." The youngest inhaled as if the room had been hiding an ocean. He leaned closer, visor nearly touching the air over the table. He said something in a dialect that sounded like knives tapping together in a drawer. The leader stilled. The others stilled. Jonas kept his eyes on the coffee. He let the moment breathe because moments, like horses, break if you pull too hard. "Say the words," Jonas said, and the tone of him turned the jukebox off without touching it. The youngest swallowed. His voice, when it arrived, was reverent and afraid. "Reaper." The name walked across the room and found him. It took a seat. It opened old doors that had been shut with the kind of care you use on nightmares. Mildred made a sound, small and defiant. She looked at Jonas as if he had borrowed a thunderstorm and forgotten to return it. The leader straightened. "That designation is classified myth," he said, and you could hear the word myth trying not to respect itself. Jonas finally lifted his gaze. His eyes were a pale color that had been drafted for difficult work. I get that a lot, he said. You think I am a ghost because it makes you feel safer about the stupid thing you have done by walking in here. The leader flexed one gauntlet, and a weapon unfolded like an origami spider learning violence. The others mirrored him, barrels irising open with a clinical sigh. Jonas placed his mug on the table with the careful mercy reserved for sleeping dogs. The tone came again, rolling low through the ground and into the bones of the diner. It was the sound of distance closing faster than nature allowed. The mercenaries stiffened. Their helmets flashed subtle signals between them, silent conversations wrapped in coded light. Jonas kept his hands flat on the table as if he were waiting for a dealer to flip the next card. Outside, the desert shimmered like it was trying to remember what it looked like before heat and history burned its patience away. The youngest merc glanced toward the windows. That sound is human, he murmured, almost to himself. The leader shot him a glare sharp enough to shave metal and turned back to Jonas. Whatever you just called, we will handle it. Jonas leaned back, the bench groaning under his weight, and let his gaze drift past the armor to the horizon. You have no idea what's about to land here, he said. Long ago, before this desert was just a forgotten corner of Earth's map, before the diner was slapped together from cheap materials and stubborn optimism, there had been another sky over him. It had been darker then, thick with the hulls of ships you could mistake for mountains until they moved. Jonas had stood on the edge of the Parhelion ridge with a rifle humming against his shoulder, and the smell of ionized air cutting through the cold. The Orion conflict had been just another war to the people who never fought in it, but to those who had, it was a storm that never stopped raining even after the clouds were gone. Back then, his call sign had not been a secret. The Reaper had been a name spoken in alien tongues with equal parts fear and fury. It was not because he killed more than anyone else, though the numbers were ugly. It was because he ended fights that should have lasted months in a matter of hours. His advantage was not strength or speed, it was the way he thought 3 moves ahead while everyone else was still deciding what to do next. His superiors called it tactical genius. His enemies called it unnatural. Jonas called it survival. The memory unrolled without asking. The Vor Dominion had been the worst of them, an empire that wrapped its cruelty in ceremony and wore it like a medal. At Parhelion Ridge, they had cornered a mining colony of civilians to bait the fleet into a trap. The order had come down from Earth Command: pull back, let the colony burn, regroup for a counterstrike later. Jonas had heard the order and then ignored it. He had rerouted every drone he could hack, laid charges in the only canyon wide enough for the Vor to pass through, and triggered the detonations just as their main force pushed forward. The canyon had collapsed, the Vor ships crushed under tons of rock and metal. The civilians had lived. His career had not. The Krell Syndicate had been there too. Not as allies or enemies exactly, but as opportunists in the chaos. In the confusion of the ridge's destruction, the Krell had lost a shipment, rumored to be more valuable than entire planets' economies. Jonas had never known what it was, but he had known the look of beings who would hold a grudge for decades. The leader's voice pulled him back to the present. Whatever you did in your wars, old man, it does not matter now. We are here for a debt. Jonas almost laughed. Debt is a funny thing. Sometimes the one you think owes you is the one who already paid in full. Mildred had retreated to the counter and was pretending to rearrange condiments, but her eyes kept darting to the window. The sound outside had grown stronger, a mechanical hum braided with the low growl of engines. She spoke without looking up. Jonas, if you've invited more trouble into my diner, you're cleaning it up yourself. Jonas did not answer. The youngest merc's voice carried a hesitant edge. We were told the Vor would pay for him. Twice the standard bounty. Enough to make the syndicate rich again. The leader gave him a sharp gesture to shut up, but Jonas caught the thread. So you're middlemen, he said. Deliver the package, get paid, and vanish before the Vor decides you know too much. The leader shifted uncomfortably, the armor's plates clicking in small betrayals of tension. Jonas could see the fracture lines forming between them. These weren't zealots or fanatics. They were professionals with rent due and debts they couldn't dodge. That made them dangerous in a different way, loyal only to the job until the job stopped making sense. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping into the calm that had unnerved soldiers on both sides of battlefields. Let me tell you something about the Vor. They do not pay twice for anything. They pay once. Then they erase you. The youngest merc swallowed hard. The leader ignored him and gestured to one of the others, who stepped forward and produced restraints that shimmered faintly in the diner light. You will come with us. Now. Jonas tilted his head toward the window. You might want to wait until after my ride gets here. The leader chuckled without humor. That sound out there? Just noise. Jonas smiled without warmth. You think storms announce themselves? You've never met my friends. The horizon broke. A black speck became a shape, became a silhouette, became a machine too fast for its size. It dropped through the sky like it was angry at the ground. The hum outside deepened until the salt shakers rattled. The leader's visor flickered with incoming data, lines of alien script feeding him measurements and threat levels. His gauntlet tightened around the weapon. Jonas kept talking, his voice carrying over the rising noise. You think the galaxy forgot about the Reaper. You think I went to ground because I was afraid. The truth is I was tired of cleaning up other people's messes. But when you come looking for me, you bring the past with you. And the past doesn't like to be woken up without a fight. The youngest merc turned toward the leader. We need to move, he said. The leader hesitated. Outside, the craft slowed, its engines changing pitch to a predatory purr. Jonas could see the heat shimmer around its hull, the same model he had once flown into war zones where the odds were mathematical suicide. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing against the walls of the diner. Mildred slammed her coffee pot down. If that thing ruins my roof, Jonas, you're paying for it. Jonas nodded once, as if he were signing an invisible contract. The youngest merc was watching him now, not with fear but with something like reluctant admiration. The leader's calm crackled, the voice on the other end speaking fast, clipped, urgent. The words were too quick for Jonas to catch, but the tone was unmistakable. Danger had arrived ahead of schedule. The leader barked an order. The mercs shifted into a defensive formation, half of them facing the door, the others keeping Jonas in their sights. The ramp of the craft dropped with a hiss and a gust of engine breath punched into the diner, lifting napkins and the smell of old coffee into a dance they were never built for. Jonas did not flinch. The Krell leader did, shifting his stance just enough to prove he had a pulse. From the craft came a silence that brimmed with intention, and then a thin cylinder rolled off the ramp and bounced gently into the doorway like a toy that had lost its child. The youngest merc raised his weapon on instinct. Do not fire, Jonas said, because he knew the shape, knew the seam along its body, knew that when it opened the room would choose sides without asking permission. The cylinder split and unfolded into a low arc projector that laced the threshold with a barely visible shimmer. The Krell leader muttered a word his translator softened, and the projector hummed, sampling air like a snake tasting rain. Two shapes followed, compact shells with spider legs unfolding, each limb putting down tiny suction feet that left no dust. They stepped into the diner as if they owned mortgages there. One snapped to face Jonas. It chirped a code that only someone who had been alive in a certain kind of war would understand. Jonas let his brow twitch. Old friend, he said softly, and the Krell leader did not like that word moving between machines and men. The drones were from a retired Earth Black unit, the kind that did not exist until they failed, and they had survived because Jonas had taught them how. He lifted a hand, palm out, and the nearer drone settled, optics dimming in a way that looked almost like relief. The leader pushed forward, barrel aimed at Jonas's chest, and that was all the permission the room needed. The jukebox clicked itself alive as if it needed dramatic accompaniment, and then the first shot bleached a line across the tiled wall. Jonas moved. He did not move young. He moved like a map being redrawn. He kicked the corner of his table so it snapped into the leader's shins, grabbed the coffee pot, and raked superheated liquid across a visor seam he remembered from a pocket manual no one else had read, then shouldered into the nearest merc with the unstoppable momentum of a man who had chosen his vector before breakfast. The drone chirped and leapt, firing a non-lethal pulse that slapped a weapon out of the air. Mildred screamed the kind of scream that translated into a ledger of repairs. The diner contracted into chaos. The youngest merc tried to bring his rifle up, and Jonas grabbed a salt shaker and slammed it into the rifle's sensor, a childish insult that worked better than it deserved. The gun hiccuped itself stupid. "Sorry about the seasoning," Jonas said, because he could not help himself. Another merc came around fast and low, blades out of his gauntlets, and Jonas caught him with the edge of a tray and a reminder that momentum is a currency if you have change. He slid behind the counter, yanked open the fryer grate, and flung it. The grate caught a boot. The merc went down swearing in a language that had more consonants than patience. The leader recovered, armor hissing as it adapted to heat and insult, and he fired a tight burst that stitched the chrome napkin holder into confetti. Jonas felt one round buzz past his ribs with the sting of a bee that did not want to apologize. He dropped and rolled, came up under the shadow of the pie case, and used it as a shield that only worked if you believed in miracles. The drone registered the math and spat a spray of chaff that glittered ugly. The leader cursed as the chaff embedded in his weapon and mag locks, a cruel confetti that told circuits to take a nap. The youngest merc lunged for Jonas, and Jonas met him halfway, caught his forearm, and spun him toward the door where the arc projector waited like a grin. "Do not cross that," Jonas said, tightening his grip just shy of compassion. The youngest looked at the shimmer and back at him. "What is it?" "A line you do not want to meet in a dark alley," Jonas said. The leader barked orders and two mercs flanked, trying to funnel Jonas into a corner. He obliged them and then betrayed physics by planting a boot on the wall, kicking off, and collapsing both their plans with the same movement. He landed crooked and his knee protested with the dignity of aging machinery. He ignored it. He grabbed the mop bucket, flung its gray water across the floor, and when one merc charged, he discovered that traction is a social contract the floor had revoked. The leader pivoted, lifted his gauntlet, and triggered something deeper in the armor. A disc popped from his wrist and bit the ceiling, spreading in a web of light that dropped like a curtain around the room. Air snapped. Jonas felt his teeth vibrate. The phase cage settled into existence, a humming dome that turned the world outside into a distant rumor and trapped them all inside with their choices. The drones flickered and went to standby, lights low like animals finding a den. Mildred stared up at the lattice of energy, and said very clearly that if this thing left scorch marks on her booths, there would be fees. Jonas straightened and took stock. The cage meant the Krell had done their homework. It also meant they were scared of what was outside in a way that made Jonas curious. He raised his hands a little, not surrender but punctuation. "So this is how you do it," he said. "Lock the doors, silence the neighborhood, and then you sell the myth to the highest bidder." The leader did not bother to deny it. He gestured and two mercs moved in with restraints that shimmered with the same energy as the cage. Jonas laughed softly. "You think those will hold?" "They only need to hold until we reach the rendezvous," the leader said. The youngest flinched at the word rendezvous as if it tasted bad. Jonas looked at him. "You keep waiting for him to tell you who you are selling me to," he said. The youngest looked away. The leader bristled. "It does not matter to you." "It matters to your bones," Jonas said. "Because if you hand me to the Vor, your bones will be the only part of you they leave to bury." The name Vor rode the air, and even the cage seemed to listen. The leader's visor shifted through a cascade of colors that meant calculation. He had not intended to say the name. Jonas had said it for him, and now it was real in the room, a new player at the table with appetites. Mildred pointed a coffee spoon at the leader as if it were a gavel. "Explain how any of you are paying for this mess if you are dead." The leader ignored her with the confidence of someone who had never dealt with itemized bills. He gestured again. The restraints marched forward like obedient jellyfish. Jonas did not back away. He waited until the cuffs were close enough to feel their charge tickle the hairs on his wrist, then he pivoted, caught the leader's gauntlet, and wrenched it sideways so the cuff kissed armor. The cuff liked the taste and sealed. The leader cursed with creativity. The merc next to him fired, a reflex more than a decision. The round tore a path through the shelf of mugs and blew ceramic dust into snow. Jonas used the moment and vanished under the counter like a card trick, rolled into the aisle, and came up with a fire extinguisher he had never hoped to need. He squeezed the handle and sent a foamy blizzard across the nearest visor. The Merc thrashed blind and the foam sizzled where it met live energy. Mildred shouted to save some for actual fires. Jonas said this is an actual fire in a different suit. The walls shuddered as the first Vor clamp locked into place, its metal teeth biting deep into the diner's frame with a sound that made every bolt complain. A hiss of pressurized air followed, and then the faint scrape of magnetic locks sealing shut. The Krell leader's posture stiffened, his visor cycling through combat modes as if switching perspectives might make the problem smaller. Jonas stood still, one hand resting on the counter, eyes on the wall as if he could see through it. He had heard that sound before in places that no longer existed. It meant the Vor boarding parties were seconds away, and when they came, they brought more than guns. Mildred leaned on the counter with the stubborn calm of someone whose world had already been upended more than once. "You boys want to take this outside," she said, "or am I charging for structural damage?" The youngest Merc, still between Jonas and the leader, glanced nervously at the arc of shadow sliding across the floor as the black comet repositioned above them. The gravity shift was subtle but enough to make the coffee in the pot slosh toward one side. The leader spoke in a clipped, private tone to his team, but Jonas could hear the tremor under the armor. The Vor were not allies to the Krell, not even business partners. They were an ocean you tried not to sail. Yet here they were, and the only thing between them and a Dominion interrogation was a temporary truce with a man whose name was supposed to be a ghost story. Jonas broke the silence. The moment those clamps cycle open, they won't care who's the bounty and who's the courier. They'll take us all. The leader bristled. "We fight together, you said?" "Until extraction." Jonas smirked faintly. "Extraction is a long way off when the thing coming for you doesn't need permission to land." The drones shifted uneasily on their spider legs, their optics tracking the vibrations in the floor. The youngest Merc adjusted his grip on his weapon and asked the leader the question hanging between them. "Who's giving the orders now?" The leader hesitated just long enough for the truth to show. Jonas answered for him. "I am. Unless you want to die in alphabetical order." Outside, the sound of the boarding clamps deepened as mechanisms inside them rotated, boring through the wall plating. Small puffs of dust shook loose from the ceiling tiles and floated in the warm air. Jonas moved quickly, grabbing the drone closest to him and rerouting its sensor feed to the other, linking them into a closed loop. The leader watched but didn't stop him. Jonas had the feel of a man who had done this in the dark more times than was comfortable to think about. He spoke while his hands worked. "Vor boarding squads like to hit in two waves. First the heavies to lock down movement, then the skinners to pull intel and bodies. We don't let them get to the second wave." The youngest asked how. Jonas tapped the counter once. "Force them into the choke point and burn the air in their lungs before they can adapt." The leader's visor turned toward him sharply. "That will kill all of us." Jonas met the gaze evenly. "Not if you know where to stand." The first breach came with a scream of metal surrendering to pressure. A section of the west wall caved inward and dropped, revealing the dim outline of Vor troops in their pressurized suits. They moved with a mechanical rhythm, not fast, not slow, just inevitable. The lead soldier stepped forward and a halo of HUD data danced in the fog of their visor. Jonas ducked behind the counter, dragging the youngest with him. "Stay low," he said. "Vor targeting systems start high and adjust down. Make them chase you." The Krell leader opened fire, the blast of his weapon lighting the dim breach like a camera flash at a crime scene. The Vor frontliners stumbled but didn't fall. Their armor was designed to absorb direct energy hits, but Jonas knew the joints were weaker. He grabbed a fork from the counter and flung it like a dart. It struck the Vor in the side of the knee joint, not to injure but to ping the targeting systems in the drones he just reprogrammed. Both drones fired simultaneously, converging on that mark, and the Vor went down with a groan of servos locking under stress. More poured in, fanning out inside the diner. Mildred dropped to the floor behind the counter, muttering about health codes, as Jonas vaulted over with a fluidity that made the youngest stare. He landed on one Vor's back, jammed a sugar dispenser into a vent seam, and yanked it open. The sudden cloud of granules tricked the Vor suit's filtration system into emergency lockdown, and the soldier stiffened mid-step. Jonas kicked off and rolled toward the east wall just as the second clamp cycled open. The leader and two of his mercs shifted fire to that side, but the Vor there were already tossing in suppression charges, small spheres that hissed before spraying the room with static interference. Jonas ducked under the spray and yelled to the youngest to kill the lights. The diner plunged into semi-darkness, broken only by the flicker of weapons fire and the red emergency bulbs that made everyone look like devils. In the dim, Jonas moved faster, his shape harder to track. He hit a Vor at the elbow, forcing their weapon up, then spun them toward the breach so their own troops fired into the gap they'd just come through. The air grew heavy with the smell of scorched polymers and something sharp that tasted like electricity. Jonas crouched near the arc projector still set at the doorway. He adjusted its field parameters until it hummed higher, then stepped back. A Vor soldier barreled toward him, weapon ready, and crossed the shimmer without hesitation. The projector discharged in a sharp, controlled burst, enough to lock the soldier's armor in place like it had suddenly been dipped in ice. Jonas shoved them aside, toppling them into another. 2 down without a single round fired. The leader shouted over the noise that they were being pushed back. Jonas knew. Vor tactics were about momentum. Let them keep it, and they would grind you flat. He spotted the youngest firing in short, controlled bursts, trying to conserve energy cells. The kid had potential, if he lived past this. Jonas slid next to him, swapping out the half-spent cell for a fresh one without asking. The Vor will try to flank through the kitchen, Jonas said. Cover the door. The youngest nodded and adjusted position. Another breach started on the roof, the metal above groaning under the weight of Vor climbers. Jonas grabbed the mop bucket again, this time not for water but for the industrial degreaser Mildred kept in the back. He yanked open a ceiling panel near the climbing point, poured the slick chemical down the beam, and waited. The first Vor dropped through and landed badly, their footing vanishing under them. Jonas was already there to drive a knee into their helmet and send them tumbling into the leader's firing line. Minutes stretched thin. The Vor's first wave was slowing but not broken. Jonas could feel the room's collective stamina fraying. The leader's breathing had gone heavier, the youngest was showing signs of fatigue, and even the drones were slowing their cycles to prevent overheating. Jonas made the call. Fall back to the counter, he said, voice like steel against stone. We let them think we're cornered. The lull after the retreat had the wrong texture, like quiet in a hospital corridor where the machines are simply between alarms. The black comet hung above the diner, as if it had been waiting all these years for this exact address, its belly lights drifting like slow fish over the dust. Jonas walked the shattered floor and reset what could be reset, moving junk chairs into improvised barricades and sliding broken booths into angles that forced sidelines. The drone skittered to where he pointed, laying down little beads the size of raindrops that were not rain at all but sensors with a mean streak. Mildred swept ceramic into a clinking pile and announced that whoever invented energy weapons had never met a responsible adult who liked her dishes whole. The Krell leader tracked the ceiling with his visor while the youngest watched Jonas with the expression of a man realizing his childhood bedtime stories were court transcripts. They knew the Vor would try again, and this time they would bring doctrine and disdain. Jonas mapped the terrain without leaving the room. The lot outside became a bowl, the diner an island on a shoal, the leaning sign a lighthouse that had stopped warning and started judging. He could feel, in the grease under his boots and the sting in his ribs, where the second siege would fold its elbows and lean. He sent the youngest to the kitchen to grab every can of cooking gas he could find and the leader to strip the booth cushions for fiber weave that would burn reluctantly. Mildred asked if this was going to require her insurance agent, and Jonas said only if her agent covered acts of former gods and current fools. The sky dimmed a notch, and the air pressure changed with a pop that made the heart itch. A low ripple went through the dirt like a hand smoothing a bedsheet. Jonas peered up and saw the comet releasing drone pods, each the shape of a mean idea, unfolding into attack cuffs that would try to bind the building itself. He pointed the drones toward the door and told them to get clever. The youngest came back with 2 tanks on a dolly, and Jonas had him wedge one under the counter and the other by the east wall where the floorboards bowed. "We are not in the business of dying on schedule," Jonas said, and the youngest nodded as if committing it to a creed. The first wave arrived without theatrics, just a new set of clamps and the elegant cruelty of focused fire. The windows went from dusty to shattered and back to dusty in the time it takes to regret a choice. Jonas dropped behind the counter and hit a sequence on the pad under his sleeve, waking the beads he had scattered. Invisible tripwires stitched the room in a web that was all the difference between a straight line and a geometry lesson. Vor crash teams tried to push through and found their suits refusing to make simple decisions, arms misreading legs, legs confused about stairs, the cool certainty of their doctrine turning into the hot embarrassment of falling forward. Jonas let the Krell leader and his 2 mercs take the initial shots, their weapons cracking like whips in a church. He conserved his energy for where the line would bend, not break. A Vor soldier cleared the arc at the door, heavier armor than before, a walking argument for over-engineering. Jonas popped up, flung a napkin dispenser into the crook of the soldier's elbow, and forced a misfire that stitched a neat row of holes in the ceiling and let sunlight drip through like confetti from a smarter party. He vaulted the counter and landed in a slide, grabbing a dropped weapon and passing it to the youngest without looking. "Forward and left," he said. The kid pivoted and made it look practiced. The drones contributed in their favorite way, which was by being obnoxious to very expensive systems. They spat noise in narrow streams that made Vor helmets believe they were facing walls where air existed and doors where none had ever been. Jonas moved through the theater of it, picking when to be seen and when to be a rumor. He turned a fallen stool into a leverage tool, used a leg to hook a Vor ankle behind a booth, and followed with a fast jab of the mop handle to a rib seam that armor designers had believed was private. Mildred ducked a spray of sparks and told them all that she would not be replacing the curtains again, and if anyone tried to pay in alien credits she would write their names on a list that never got erased. They were holding, by intellect more than mass, when the comet changed the rules. The roof sighed in a language lumber learns in its old age, and a series of penetrators drilled straight down like accusations, embedding smart rods that began to vibrate at a pitch that made everything rattled feel like a confession. The Krell leader cursed and turned to bark orders, and that was when he did it, the motion so smooth it could have been rehearsed. He raised his left gauntlet and fired a narrow burst that would not puncture but would stun at close range, the kind of shot designed for a bounty that needed to walk. It drilled into Jonas's shoulder and snapped his nerves into a white howl. He dropped to a knee and the floor tilted because pain has a way of moving architecture. The youngest reacted before the leader could fire again, his hand snapping out in a gesture both pleading and decisive. He slapped the gauntlet and forced it skyward, and the second round hissed harmlessly into the ruined ceiling. The leader spun on him, rage glowing under the visor, and the argument that had been mixing in the air since the diner's bell chimed finally rose. "We had a deal," the leader hissed. "We did," the youngest said, "but not this deal. Not with them." Around them, the Vor kept coming, stubborn and methodical, and Jonas forced his shoulder to remember it had a job. He pushed himself up along the counter while the stunned half-life burned out of his muscles. "You picked your moment badly," he said, not so much angry as disappointed by the lack of elegance. "Trust is a rickety ladder, and they scrambled back up it because the alternative was a pit." The leader hesitated, then pointed his weapon outward again and ordered his mercs to cover the east breach. The youngest took position by Jonas, and for a second the war looked almost organized. The comet lowered itself another few meters, gravity edging heavier, dust lifting in slow curtains. Jonas used the extra pull to his advantage, sliding a heavy table into a capture rail he had bolted into the floor on a hunch 3 years ago when the scar itched and the hawks circled low. He keyed the rail and felt it lock. "Now," he said, and the youngest yanked a line he had hidden in the jukebox days earlier, a line that ran under the floor to the gas tank resting on the bowed boards. The road away from the diner was a ribbon of cracked asphalt that seemed to lead both somewhere and nowhere at the same time. Jonas walked at a pace that didn't look hurried, but each step carried a weight that even the desert wind couldn't sweep away. The Krell leader and his 2 surviving mercs kept their distance, partly out of habit, partly because they still hadn't decided whether Jonas was an ally, a liability, or just a story they'd regret surviving. The youngest stayed close, matching stride without making it look deliberate. He carried the two drones, one under each arm, like a shepherd carrying stubborn animals. Above them, the horizon shimmered with heat, but behind them the plume of the black comet's wreck still clawed at the sky, a black finger pointing at the place where everything had gone wrong. They stopped at the edge of the dry wash, a gash in the land where water once ran and now only sand whispered. The Krell leader signaled his team to drop into the cut, where they would be harder to spot from the air. Jonas stayed on the ridge a moment longer, scanning the sky. There were no ships yet, no vor pursuit, but the silence didn't trust itself. He had fought too many campaigns to believe in clean exits. The leader called up to him, reminding him of the direction they'd agreed on. Jonas didn't answer right away. He kept watching the sky until he saw a thin streak vanish into the distance, too high to be an escape pod, too slow to be a fighter. Recon. The Vor were already writing the next move. When he finally dropped down into the wash, the heat closed around them like a second skin. The sand swallowed sound, forcing them into a quiet that was less peaceful than it was tense. Jonas kept an eye on the youngest, who seemed to be carrying the weight of more than just drones. The kid glanced over once and asked the question that had been burning since the fight. Were the stories about you true? Jonas didn't slow his pace. Most of them are lies, he said. The rest are worse. The kid didn't ask again, but his grip on the drones tightened as if holding a piece of the legend for himself. By late afternoon they reached the ruins of a long-abandoned service station. Its roof had partially collapsed, and the sign out front hung by a single rusted chain, creaking in the wind. Jonas swept through the interior first, his eyes and instincts finding the places someone could hide or trap. Empty. Just dust, the ghost of old fuel, and the faint smell of desert animals who came and went without caring about history. They set up inside, using the shadow of the remaining wall to break the sun. The Krellmerks kept watch, one scanning with optics while the other cleaned a weapon with the care of someone fixing a tool they might have to rely on before dinner. Mildred arrived just before sunset, walking up the road like she was out for groceries. She had a canvas bag over one shoulder, and she dropped it at Jonas's feet with a sound that told him it was heavier than it looked. Inside were a few sealed rations, a dented thermos, and a wrapped bundle that turned out to be a ledger. Thought you might need this, she said. Jonas asked how she'd gotten here. She said the back roads were still hers and no one had ever thought to take them away. The Krell leader eyed her like she was another complication, but Jonas just nodded and told her she'd made it in time for the last light. They ate without talking much, everyone conserving their voices and their trust. When darkness fell, the desert cooled and the wind shifted, carrying the faint hum of something mechanical far off to the north. Jonas moved to the edge of the wash and listened, letting the sound fill his ears until the pattern told him what he needed. Not Vor. Not Krell. Something smaller, faster, less organized. Bounty teams. He went back to the group and told them they had until morning before more trouble arrived. The leader asked if they should run. Jonas said you don't run from a storm that big, you find a better place to stand when it hits. The youngest sat next to him after the others settled in. He said he'd been offered a place in the syndicate because he was good at following orders and better at surviving them, but that nothing in his training had prepared him for someone like Jonas. Jonas told him training was just the scaffolding. You only learn what you're made of when the building starts to burn. The kid asked if Jonas would join them now, fight with them until it was done. Jonas shook his head. I'm not crew. I'm the guy you hire when you can't afford to hire anyone else. The kid didn't like the answer, but he didn't argue. Later, under a sky so full of stars it looked like the universe had cracked, Jonas sat alone on the roofless part of the station. The air had that cold clarity the desert keeps for itself at night. He could still feel the pulse of the day's fights in his bones, each injury a drumbeat reminding him he wasn't finished yet. Somewhere out there, the Vor were regrouping. The Comets lost just a line in a report that would be answered with ships and fury. Somewhere else, other factions would hear the name Reaper whispered again and start wondering what it might cost to find him first. The quiet life he had been pretending to live was gone, and pretending again would only be lying to himself. Mildred climbed up beside him without asking. She handed him a cup of whatever was in her thermos. It tasted bitter and strong enough to sand metal. She said she'd known it wouldn't last, that he wasn't built for watching the desert from the same chair every morning. Jonas asked if she was going back to the diner. She said she might, depending on whether it was still standing. If not, there were other diners, other chairs, other stubborn customers who paid their bills in trouble. He smiled faintly at that. She patted his shoulder and went back down to sleep. Near dawn, the youngest woke him. A comm unit in his pack had picked up a short, encrypted transmission. It wasn't Krell, and it wasn't Vor. Jonas took it, tuned it, and listened to a voice that carried no introduction. Reaper, the galaxy's about to burn again. His thumb rested on the power switch, and for a moment he considered pretending he hadn't heard it. But the moment passed, because moments like that always do. He slid the unit back to the kid and told him to keep it charged. When the sun rose, it painted the desert in long lines of gold that made even the ruins look like they belonged. The Krell leader was already up, his armor powered and his eyes on the horizon. He said they were moving out, heading deeper into the wasteland where fewer people could find them. He didn't ask Jonas to come. Jonas didn't offer. They shook hands like men who knew they might meet again in a place with fewer choices.